exciting symposium, and also to Professor Takezawa and her staff for conceptualizing the theme in such a unique and interesting way. I'm really honored to be able to participate in a project which, in my mind, tries to both look at the specificities of racism in the Japanese and broader East Asian context, while also looking at some of the continuities across the globe. And it seems to me that it's really important for us to do both sides in that project. I gave a title initially that was both too ambitious and too ambiguous, which is a rather bad combination. So I'm really going to talk mainly about two dimensions of what I feel to be important parts of racism, and that is the relationship between the so-called emperor system, or Tennosei, and modern racism, and then look at the ways in which modern racism look at the ways in which Tennosei needs to be thought of as part of global modernity and a global racism, despite its unique features. Because of the time limit, I'm going to read most of my paper. So first, the introduction. Common sense and some strands of existing scholarship give the impression that Japanese racism is unique because the Japanese have so often practiced racism against those who resemble themselves physically. Typically, the cases of discrimination against the Buraku minority as well as other Asians, especially those who've been victimized by Japanese militarism, colonialism, imperialism, and post-colonial discrimination, are given to support such an argument. The assumption behind this view is that in the West, racism is practiced against so-called visible minorities whose physical appearance, most importantly skin color and other bodily features, mark them as different from the dominant white population. The main thrust of the exceptionalist understanding of Japanese racism is that historically, the Japanese have so often practiced racial discrimination against those who look like themselves, and that this is rather puzzling and anomalous, especially when compared to what is assumed to be the global standard of modern racism, that is to say, Western racism. Yet such an exceptionalist view is misleading for many reasons, and I have only time to mention two important ones for this paper. First, while the common sense exceptionalist view rests upon the assumption that Western racism is what might be called ocular-centric, that is to say that Western racism is based upon the association of racial difference with visible corporeal markings, scholars of race increasingly assert that racism in the modern West has not been strictly about visible, observable differences. Thus, while some find the origins of modern European racism in perceptions of bodily differences emerging in the 14th and 15th century introduction of sub-Saharan slaves to the Iberian Peninsula and the subsequent expansion of slavery, it's also commonly said that modern racism can be traced to the anti-Semitism of that period. Yet this anti-Semitism, which is so often regarded as the paradigmatic case of racism in Europe, was tied less to physical features that could be recognized by sight than to religion and blood. The certificates of blood purity dating from this period would seem to indicate a belief that racial inheritance are ineffable and imperceptible to the human eye. In other words, invisible. It's not necessary to rehearse the entire history of modern racism outside of Japan to understand that racism in the so-called West and its colonies has taken its foundations, not just the visible, but a range of imaginary indices of human difference. The second problem with the common sense view of Japanese exceptionalism is that, as other scholars have already pointed out, Japanese racism has never been uniform. For instance, Japanese physical anthropology was founded upon the belief that the Japanese are physiologically unique and internally homogeneous as measured through such indices as height, cranial weight and structure, facial features, blood type, and so on. Yet, as Kim Chol has argued, Despite the obsession of anthropologists to verify the boundary between the Japanese and their others through empirical observation, their efforts produced an avalanche of data that ultimately generated confusion and anxieties about what really distinguished the Japanese from their colonial subjects. For example, despite listing some 46 items for distinguishing Koreans from Japanese by appearance, a 1913 memo circulated by the Japanese Home Ministry's Police Bureau titled Essentials for Distinguishing Koreans provided little certitude, let alone practical guidance about racial or ethnic difference, since some of the criteria offered to distinguish Koreans from Japanese could easily have been applied to those assumed to be ethnically Japanese rather than Korean. For instance, it was said that, quote, they, the Koreans, have little facial hair. They often have flat faces with thin beards, unquote. In fact, more often than not, theorists of race denied the existence of any visual differences between the Japanese and Koreans. Now, this retracing of the contradictions and ambiguities in the characteristics of both Japanese racism and racism as it has been practiced in the Western world could go on at much greater length based upon the large body of scholarly research that now exists on these topics. But I start with this brief overview to underscore one of the paradoxes of current views of Japanese racism. While common sense tends to emphasize its unique qualities as a racism that is not based upon visible corporal differences, the weight of research on racism in Japan and outside of it tells us that racisms everywhere do not necessarily privilege only what can be seen on the body. Everywhere, it seems, racism seems to find its stimulus in visible and invisible signs of human difference that range from physical features to blood inheritances and to a variety of cultural characteristics that make up what Etienne Balibar and others have theorized as cultural racism. The central question I wish to pose in this paper is, to what extent can we acknowledge the historical and regional specificities of Japanese racism without ending in an exceptionalist analysis? Put differently, how might it be possible to investigate the particularities of the history of Japanese racism, not as a final goal, but as part of a larger project to interrogate the historical and ongoing virulence of racism as a part of global modernity? While such a method could take a number of different routes, I will focus my analysis on the site of the Japanese monarchy and what has been called the emperor system, or tennosei. The latter, it should be noticed, is that system which has the monarchy as its central symbol and which is comprised of the larger structures and processes of capitalism and the nation-state formation. I focus on the monarchy because many scholars and activists have long argued that the Japanese emperor system has served historically and in the present as a linchpin for social discrimination, or sabetsu, whether practiced inside or outside of the nation. So let me turn to part 2, which has the subtitle, The Monarch as a Sign of Modern Normative Race and Culture. In a path-breaking essay on the emperor system in modern Japan, the historian Hirota Masaki convincingly showed how the Japanese monarch had been reinvented in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in such a way as to stand at the apex of a modern system of social discrimination. While debunking the common myth that discrimination in modern Japan could be explained as a straightforward inheritance of pre-modern forms of discrimination, such as those associated with ritual purity and defilement, he identified several new modes by which discrimination began to operate. These, he insisted, were symptomatic of Japan's modernity rather than legacies of the past. While Hirota used the term discrimination rather than racism, jinshu sugi or racism, perhaps in part because racism has come to be so associated with observable differences, I would argue that at least 3 elements of the new modalities of discrimination that he identified with the emperor system should be understood as fundamental to modern racism in Japan, and that also link this version of racism to racisms throughout the world. First, Hirota pointed out that the concepts of blood purity and lineage only came to be associated with the imperial household in modern times. In developing this argument, Hirota drew from the work of the historian Yasumaru Yoshio, who showed that the idea that the imperial line had existed without interruption from time immemorial had not been prominent in Japan until the late Tokugawa period, roughly the early 19th century or so, and that it only became formalized with the Meiji Constitution, which was promulgated in 1889. Furthermore, Hirota drew a parallel between this new understanding of the continuity of the imperial bloodline and a broader emerging discourse on the importance of blood in determining individual abilities. For instance, Hirota showed that despite his apparent commitment to the ideology of human equality and the importance of education over natural inheritances, the modern liberal thinker Fukuzawa Yukichi believed that blood and family lineage had a strong role in determining individual capabilities. Thus, in his 1876 essay on blood lineage, Kettoron, Fukuzawa maintained that, quote, if those endowed with great intellectual powers today owe a great deal to the gift of inheritances passed on through their ancestors, then even with regard to future descendants, how could their intelligence or stupidity not be passed on through the people of today? In short, the birth of the modern imperial system coincided with and reinforced a naturalistic mentality based on the symbolism of blood lineage. Moreover, Hirota insisted that this emphasis on blood lineage, far from representing a throwback to ancient traditions, was bound up with the establishment of the modern family or household as a fundamental component of capitalist modernity. Furthermore, the symbolism of blood could easily be transferred from concepts of unbroken family lineages, including that of the imperial household, to convictions about the unity of blood among the Japanese race. Hirota also suggested that in the late 19th century, the emperor came to be associated with modern concepts of hygiene and civilization, and that these cultural indices became entangled with the idea of blood. Thus, he finds evidence of a dramatic transformation in measures taken to construct symbolic barriers protecting the physical presence of the emperor from contamination. Shortly after the Meiji Restoration, such precautions, as evidenced in instructions for preparing the routes of the emperor's travel, still reflected pre-modern understandings of defilement. This defilement was associated with the work of the Buraku people in animal flesh and skin, as well as the archaic system of mourning and abstentions. While fully acknowledging that modern understandings of defilement drew from this archaic system of discrimination, Hirota argued that modern discrimination, or what I would call modern racism, was fundamentally transformed by a new ideology of cleanliness. At a time when the spread of contagious diseases such as cholera and the accumulation of scientific knowledge joined to stimulate an abhorrence of the unclean, the will to sanitize, confine, and disinfect incited a new type of scientized discrimination against particular peoples, including the Buraku minority. This relationship between hygiene and social discrimination, as Hirota explained, can be seen in, quote, both the divinization of the emperor at society's apex and in the slums of the poor and among the diseased in society's lower reaches, unquote. Finally, Hirota argued that from the 19th century, the emperor came to represent civilization, or bunmei, an idea that was very closely coupled with the ideology of hygiene. While the emperor emphasized civilization and enlightenment, those considered savage and unenlightened, such as the Ainu and Okinawans, became objects of contempt. In my view, the three indices described above, which include blood purity and lineage, hygiene, and degree of civilization, have been some of the most critical components in engendering racist thought and practices in Japan. Furthermore, these components indicate that racism of the Japanese type is less exceptional than a variant of modern racism throughout the world. It is also important to note that racism in Japan as elsewhere has always been in constant flux, and that it is precisely the multiplicity of concrete stimuli for racist discrimination, some visible on the body, some cultural, and some others quite ineffable, that make it possible for racism to survive even when disavowed or denied. Okay, the third part is on the Second World War period. The disavowal of racism and the Second World War. For an example of the resilience of racism despite its disavowal, let us take the example of racism's transformation during the Second World War. As I have argued in some detail elsewhere, the demands of sustaining total war pushed several regimes during the Second World War, most notably the Japanese and the US ones are the ones that I've studied, to repeatedly and consistently deny that they practiced racist discrimination. That is to say, the necessity of mobilizing diverse domestic and colonial populations for war and to enlist variously racialized peoples throughout the Asia-Pacific as collaborators, these domestic and global factors pushed each of these regimes to claim that it stood for freedom and equality. At the same time, each warring empire charged that their respective enemies were the true racist powers. Within this context of the mutually engendered disavowal of racism, Japanese ideologues and colonial administrators rarely associated the Japanese monarch with Japanese biological superiority. Instead, even when they invoked blood, they usually did so in order to affirm their racial unity with other Asians. The doctrine on the commonality of Korean and Japanese ancestors, which was also mentioned by Professor Takezawa, has been noted by scholars in this regard. But even more remarkable, given the racist brutality inflicted on Koreans and other colonial subjects, the emperor and the empire that he symbolized could be made to stand in this period for the transcendence of racism and the equality of all. In fact, this was the trend through the course of the war, which only came to be reversed upon Japan's defeat. Because the issue of Asian commonality is more well known, I want to devote the rest of this section to the emperor as a problematic symbol of Japan's transcendence of racial discrimination. My first example comes from a document found in the Colonial Archive that reveals how the material and ideational demands of waging total war pushed Japanese colonial bureaucrats toward the disavowal of racism. On the 19th of February 1943, Tanaka Tokutaro, who was a longtime bureaucrat in the Korean government general, addressed an audience of colonial officials and high-ranking military officers charged with implementing the military conscription system in Korea. The decision to extend this system to the colony had been made in the previous year, and by the time he gave his lecture, preparations were well underway for drafting Koreans into the Japanese military. In his presentation, Tanaka rejected a biologistic or naturalistic understanding of the differences that distinguish Koreans from the metropolitan Japanese. In fact, he pointed out that the two ethnic groups, the Japanese and the Koreans, had emerged from the same origin and root, as he called them, and that they could not be distinguished from one another by appearance. And yet he fully acknowledged and problematized the real differences in the ethnic character of the two peoples. These were differences, he explained, that had been produced by history, not nature, and were evident in what he described as, using a kind of strange word in this context in Japanese, naiyo, or internal content, or what I would call interiority, or in Japanese, naimensei, that these were important rather than external appearance, what he called gaiyo. Tanaka argued that over the course of thousands of years, divergent geographical relations, domestic, political, and social conditions, and religious and moral ideas, and so on in the two countries have produced distinctions that could not be seen in physical features, but could clearly be found in the, what he called the thought and character of the two ethnic groups. Having introduced this primary theme, Tanaka went on to elaborate on the concrete traits of the Korean ethnic group's thought and character. He described almost all of these as weaknesses or faults in their interiority, and he contrasted these with the superior quality of the metropolitan Japanese. Thus, he maintained that Koreans were dishonest, that they lacked sincerity, that they had weak consciousness, and a poor sense of responsibility. He said that Koreans have no sense of empathy and will only be kind to others if it's in their self-interest to do so. Tanaka continued on at some length to delineate further negative qualities of Korean thought and character. Yet what I want to turn to now is Tanaka's understanding of how many of the major faults of the Korean people stem from flaws in their spirituality, particularly in their lack of faith in the gods and emperor. So I really want to make a strong point about the shift in the type of racism in this period towards something approximating subjectivity or interiority. In contrast to the strong religious beliefs of the Japanese in the gods and their belief in the progenitor of the imperial line, that is the sun goddess, the Korean people lacked reverence, he said, for the gods and treated their monarch only as the, quote, supreme political power in one nation and not as the sublime center of spirituality, unquote. In reasoning that the Korean lack of religious or spiritual faith had precluded the formation of a subjective sense of obligation and responsibility, while Japanese faith in the symbolic emperor and sun goddess had been conditions for precisely this kind of interiority, Tanaka's logic is strongly reminiscent of Max Weber's understanding that the formation of a modern subjectivity in the West had emerged in tandem with the Protestant absolutization of faith in the radically transcendent God. Yet even more interesting in terms of the cultural racism that's evident from the above summary of some of Tanaka's derogatory views of the Koreans is that Tanaka tied the superiority of the Japanese interiority to their sense of time. A sense of time, he emphasized, that had arisen and been sustained by the continuity of the imperial line. The Koreans, he noted, had experienced no less than 10 revolutions since Tangun's founding of the first dynasty in Korea. In other words, they had experienced a discontinuous past that engendered not temporal continuity, but the inability to sense time evolving endlessly in the future. Without an understanding of eternity, he said, the Korean people lived only in makeshift fashion, from day to day, toiling away, while unable to plan for the future. Tanaka's main point concerning time and the emperor was thus that the continuity of the imperial lineage, as understood in the phrase Banseike, or one unbroken line since time immemorial, had given the metropolitan Japanese a heightened sense of perpetuity and made possible what we can recognize as a linear and progressive sense of time that fit well with modern ideas about the responsible subject in world history, and that also made possible a cultural racism that measured the value of peoples based upon their relative lag or progress along a linear path of development. Nowhere in his lecture did Tanaka support the idea that biological or natural inheritances made the Japanese superior to the Koreans, and nowhere did he represent the emperor or imperial line as an embodiment or symbol of racial or ethnic superiority in the biological or natural sense. Instead, he stressed the ability of Koreans to attain the same faith in the sun goddess as the metropolitan Japanese, as well as an unwavering belief in submission to the emperor. As Tanaka also explained in the question and answer period that followed his lecture, quote, it should not be said that the sun goddess is the ancestor of the Yamato ethnos, or that she is not the ancestor of the Koreans. Instead of uttering such things, in general, anyone who is Japanese should, as a subject of the emperor, revere and offer sincere devotion to the founding ancestor of the imperial line, the sun goddess, unquote. When Tanaka explained that, quote, anyone who is Japanese, unquote, should have faith and belief, he meant to include the Koreans in the category of the Japanese. For while he repeatedly affirmed the low level of Koreans' ability to attain such an interiority, he stressed that for the system of military conscription in Korea to succeed, it would be necessary to implant in the Korean people precisely this type of soul or spirit, tamashi. In short, not biological race, but divergent histories had separated the Korean and metropolitan Japanese peoples, and now faith and spirituality could unify them under the emperor and imperial lineage. And yet it should be noted that reinserting the Korean people into the temporality anchored by the myth of the unbroken imperial line left room for discriminating against them as lagging in historical time or development. The idea that spirituality or the soul, rather than biological race, comprised the source of unity for an expanding concept of the Japanese was also articulated in very sophisticated ways in wartime discussions around the question of Japan's relationship to modernity and the empire's construction of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. I want to now turn to the volume of essays that came out of the famous Overcoming Modernity Symposium of July 1942. This is the Kindai no Chokoku Symposium, which took place just 7 months before the Tanaka speech analyzed just now. We will see that considerable resonances between the ideas invoked by Tanaka and those articulated by some of Japan's most prominent public intellectuals at this symposium. Where we will see that, although I'll also note the obstinacy of a new type of blood symbolism in some thinkers. The essays and discussions collected in the volume that came out of the Overcoming Modernity Symposium show little concern to establish a biological or naturalistic understanding of the Japanese as a supposed leader of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They also do not attempt to legitimize colonialism per se. Instead, the consistent theme throughout the essays and the transcript of the symposium discussions is that it is primarily the Japanese spirit that enables Japan to be at the forefront of world history and to unify the empire. To be sure, the metaphor of Japanese blood appears sporadically throughout the essays, and the emperor does not appear as often as one might expect, given common understandings of the centrality of the monarch to Japanese nationalism and imperialism in this period. So it may be asked how this symposium is relevant to my point about the disavowal of naturalistic racism and the centrality of the emperor to a racism based on culture or civilization. What I propose to do in the following is to briefly analyze the writer and critic Hayashi Fusao's contribution to the symposium, since his essay elaborates at some length on the meaning of blood in relation to the emperor. While such a relation would seem to promote a naturalistic understanding of race, and I do believe that Hayashi perpetuated this belief more strongly than other participants in the symposium, his elaboration of the concept of heart or spirit, kokoro, considerably complicated the meaning of blood inheritance and shifted the idea of racial Japaneseness to a matter of spirit or interiority and, in fact, voluntarism. How much time do I have left? 2 minutes. Oh, no. So I won't be able to get into the details of Hayashi Fusao, but if I would want to summarize the point that I wanted to make here, Hayashi, although he talked about blood, had a very interesting notion about it, that in fact the spirit of being Japanese lay dormant in the blood of the so-called Japanese. And it was only with some kind of spiritual awakening that people could become really Japanese in a creative sense. And he said that, and he did not really limit the boundaries of who one could consider to be Japanese. So it was very ambiguous about who fit in and who did not fit into this category of the Japanese. Okay. In completely ignoring the question of where to set the boundaries of who is Japanese in the ethnological sense or in the racial sense is what he meant, he opened up the possibility that Japanese subjects in the colonies could be considered truly Japanese as long as they embodied the so-called heart of imperial loyalty, which is exactly the point that was made by Tanaka Tokutaro. So let me turn to the conclusion. In the above, I focus primarily on the Japanese monarchy to suggest that the bases of racism in modern Japan, like those for racism in Euro-American contexts, have been multiple, complex, often contradictory, and in constant flux. Nevertheless, in the case of racist discrimination in Japan, several elements stand out. These include anxieties produced by a search for certitude in differences of physical appearance, blood lineage in a naturalistic sense, an abhorrence of unhygienic practice, and a civilizational discourse which measured humanity on a timeline of advancement from savagery to leadership in world civilization. The material and ideological demands of total war produced more than at any other period of history a disavowal of racist discrimination. And this has continued into the present. So the legacy that I see of the Second World War, both for Japan and the United States, was that this was a moment for the tremendous disavowal of racism. And the key to understanding racism today, I think, is how racism continues despite its denial, despite proclamations of equality, and so forth. In closing, I want to return to my opening claim that racism in modern Japan is fundamentally continuous with racist discrimination in the so-called West, and that it is, if anything, but a regional inflection of the modern racism that can be found throughout the world. Following Michel Foucault, I propose that our understanding of racist discrimination should be capacious enough to include discrimination against all those considered inferior in normalizing societies, which is to say in modern societies which fragment the field of the human in relation to what is considered normal, and which then order individuals and subpopulations on the basis of their proximity to normality. In such normalizing societies, decisions are made about who must live and who must die. Normalization creates caesura, separating the population so that those considered inferior may be sacrificed. Racism operates to determine who ultimately may live and prosper, and who may languish or die. Defined in this broad way, we can see how a range of factors from the highly visible to the observationally imperceptible, from supposed racial endowments of a biological kind to products of history and culture, how all these have colluded to produce and reproduce racist discrimination in different ways over time. Interrogating the ways in which particular histories and regional conditions have produced unique inflections of racism in different regions of the globe at different times is, of course, necessary because racism never appears in its universal form. Otherwise, it would not be universal. It is always specific. And yet, exceptionalist explanations not only ignore the globality of the modernity that is the condition for racism, they also impede anti-racist work across national and regional boundaries. Thank you.